Imagine you are the most powerful empire on earth. Your ships sail every ocean. Your factories hum day and night. Your currency is trusted from London to Calcutta. You have never lost a war that truly mattered to you. And yet, somewhere on the other side of the world, there is a civilization so ancient, so vast, so utterly self-contained that it looks at everything you have built and says, "We do not want it. We do not need you. Go home." That was the problem Britain faced with China in the early 19th century. And the solution Britain chose would become one of the most controversial, debated and consequential decisions in the history of modern empire. It would reshape two of the world's greatest civilizations. It would open ports that had been closed for generations. It would humiliate a dynasty that had ruled for 2 centuries. And it would plant seeds of resentment so deep that they are still growing today. This is the story of the Opium Wars. Not just a story of cannon fire and trade deficits, but a story about what happens when 2 worlds, each convinced of its own superiority, collide. A story about silver, smoke, sovereignty, and the terrible arithmetic of addiction. A story about how one empire's commercial desperation became another civilization's national wound. And it begins, as so many world-changing stories do, not with a battle, but with a cup of tea. By the late 18th century, Britain had developed something close to a national obsession with Chinese tea. This was not a minor cultural preference. Tea had become the drink of the British working class, the fuel of industrialization, the social ritual that structured daily life from the coal mines of Wales to the drawing rooms of Mayfair. The British East India Company was importing tens of millions of pounds of tea every year from China, and demand was rising constantly. The problem was payment. China, under the Qing Dynasty, operated on a silver standard. Chinese merchants wanted silver in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. They did not want British manufactured goods. They did not want British woolens or British clockwork mechanisms or British anything, really. The Qing court had famously told a British diplomatic mission in 1793, led by Lord Macartney, that China possessed all things in prolific abundance and had no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for its own produce. That letter, written in the name of the Qianlong Emperor, was not merely diplomatic posturing. It reflected a genuine worldview. China had, for most of recorded history, been the center of its own universe. The tribute system that organized China's foreign relations was not designed for equal exchange. It was designed for acknowledgement of Chinese centrality. Foreign rulers sent gifts to Beijing. The emperor, in his benevolence, sent gifts back. This was not trade in the Western sense. It was theater, and China was always the main stage. Britain, on the other hand, was entering one of the most dynamic commercial periods in human history. The Industrial Revolution was generating wealth and manufactured goods at a pace the world had never seen. British merchants were not interested in performing ritual submission. They wanted markets. They wanted balance of trade. And right now, the balance was running very badly against them. Silver was flowing out of Britain and into China in enormous quantities. Between roughly 1760 and 1800, the trade deficit was significant and growing. The East India Company was under pressure from shareholders, from Parliament, and from the basic mathematics of commerce. Something had to change, and someone at some point realized that China did have one significant weakness, one appetite that could be exploited. The Chinese had been using opium medicinally for centuries. But smoking opium, which produces a far more intense and addictive experience, had become increasingly common in certain parts of Chinese society by the 18th century. The Qing government had banned the practice. The bans were not well enforced, and the East India Company, which controlled the opium-growing regions of Bengal in India, began to see an opportunity. The logic was simple and brutal. If Britain could not sell China what China wanted, perhaps Britain could sell China something China did not yet know it needed. The company began exporting Bengal opium to China through a network of private merchants, often called country traders, who operated at arm's length from the company itself. This allowed the company to maintain a degree of official deniability while still profiting from the arrangement. The opium was sold in India, the proceeds were used to buy silver, and the silver was used to buy tea. The triangle closed neatly. The trade deficit began to reverse. Through the 1800s and 1810s, the volume of opium flowing into China grew steadily. By the 1820s, it was growing rapidly. By the 1830s, it had become a flood. Estimates vary among historians, but somewhere between 4 and 40,000 chests of opium, each containing roughly 140 pounds of the drug, were being imported annually by the late 1830s. The numbers are disputed, but the direction is not. This was one of the largest drug trafficking operations in history, and it was being run, at least indirectly, by the most powerful commercial empire on earth. The consequences inside China were devastating. Addiction spread across social classes, from dock workers and soldiers to scholars and officials. The silver that had once flowed into China was now flowing out, reversing the trade balance in Britain's favor, but draining the Chinese economy. Tax revenues fell as silver became scarce. The military, with soldiers increasingly dependent on the drug, was compromised. The Qing court received reports from provincial governors describing entire communities hollowed out by addiction. This was not a minor social problem, it was a civilizational emergency. The emperor who would have to confront this crisis was the Qianlong Emperor, a man who had come to power in 1820 and who was, by most accounts, genuinely committed to good governance and deeply alarmed by what he was hearing from his officials. He was not a weak man, though history has sometimes portrayed him that way. He was a man facing an almost impossible set of circumstances, trying to apply traditional Confucian principles of moral governance to a problem that had no traditional solution. In the late 1830s, Qianlong convened a series of imperial debates about how to respond to the opium crisis. The debate was serious and substantive. Some officials argued for legalization and taxation on the grounds that prohibition had clearly failed and that the government might as well capture the revenue. Others argued for strict enforcement. The emperor ultimately sided with the hardliners. He would send a special commissioner to Canton, the one port where foreign trade was legally permitted, with full authority to end the opium trade by whatever means necessary. The man he chose was Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu was, by any measure, one of the most impressive officials in the Qing government. He was a scholar who had passed the highest imperial examinations. He was a governor who had actually enforced anti-opium laws in his own province, with measurable results. He was incorruptible in an era when corruption was endemic, and he was utterly, completely convinced that he was right. He arrived in Canton in March 1839 with the full weight of imperial authority behind him and a mission that was, in his own mind, both morally and legally unambiguous. He moved fast. He arrested Chinese opium dealers. He pressured Chinese merchants who worked with foreign traders, and then he turned to the foreigners themselves. He demanded that all foreign merchants surrender their opium stocks immediately, unconditionally, and without compensation. He wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria, a letter that was probably never actually delivered but which survives as one of the most extraordinary diplomatic documents of the century. In it, he appealed to her moral sense, asking how Britain could profit from destroying the bodies and souls of Chinese people. He pointed out that Britain itself banned opium domestically. He asked, with genuine bewilderment, how a civilized nation could justify doing to others what it would not tolerate being done to itself. It was a good question. It did not get a good answer. The British Superintendent of Trade in Canton at the time was Captain Charles Elliot, a man whose position was genuinely difficult. He was not a drug dealer. He was a naval officer and a diplomat, and he was personally uncomfortable with the opium trade. But he was also the representative of British commercial interests, and those interests were substantial. When Lin Zexu surrounded the foreign trading quarter, the factories with Chinese troops and cut off food supplies, Elliot faced a crisis. He urged the foreign merchants to surrender their opium, promising on his own authority and without authorization from London that the British government would compensate them for their losses. This was a fateful promise. It was not his to make, but it committed the British government to a position before anyone in London had decided what that position should be. Lin Zexu received over 20,000 chests of opium. He destroyed it all, mixing it with salt and lime in large trenches near the sea, then flushing it into the ocean. It took 23 days. He reportedly apologized to the spirit of the sea for the pollution. The destruction was thorough, public, and deliberately symbolic. This was not just law enforcement. This was a statement. China would not be bullied. The news reached London months later, filtered through reports from Elliot and the outraged merchants who had lost their stocks. The reaction in Britain was complicated. There was genuine discomfort, even in Parliament, about the nature of the trade. The philosopher and parliamentarian William Ewart Gladstone, who would later become one of Britain's greatest prime ministers, stood up in the House of Commons and gave a speech that has echoed through history. He asked whether there had ever been a war more unjust in its origins, a war more calculated to cover Britain with permanent disgrace. He called it a war to protect an infamous contraband trade. He was outvoted. The government of Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary who would drive British policy through this period, took a different view. Palmerston was not primarily defending the opium trade. He was defending British subjects, British property, and what he considered British honour. The Chinese had seized goods belonging to British merchants, even if those goods were illegal under Chinese law. The Chinese had confined British subjects. The Chinese had treated British representatives without the diplomatic respect that Palmerston believed was their due. And behind all of this was the larger question of trade access, the question that had been building for decades. Palmerston wanted China open. Not just cracked open, but properly, legally, permanently open to British commerce on terms that Britain could accept. The opium crisis was, from his perspective, the occasion, not the cause. The cause was the entire structure of the Canton system, the restrictions on trade, the refusal of the Qing court to engage with Britain as an equal sovereign nation, the whole edifice of Chinese exceptionalism that had frustrated British merchants and diplomats for a century. In June 1840, a British naval expedition arrived off the Chinese coast. It was a formidable force by the standards of the time: warships, troop transports, and thousands of soldiers. The technological gap between the two sides was significant, though perhaps not as absolute as it is sometimes portrayed. The Qing military had been in decline for decades, weakened by internal rebellions, corruption, and the simple fact that it had not fought a major external war in generations. The Chinese had coastal fortifications and a large army, but the army was not well equipped, not well trained for this kind of warfare, and not well led. The British moved up the Chinese coast, bypassing Canton initially, seizing the island of Zhoushan and threatening the mouth of the Yangtze River. This was strategically brilliant and psychologically devastating. The Yangtze was the economic artery of China. Control of its mouth meant the ability to strangle the empire's internal trade. The Qing court, which had initially dismissed the British threat, began to take it seriously. What followed over the next 2 years was not a single decisive battle, but a series of engagements, negotiations, retreats, and renewed fighting that reflected the fundamental confusion on both sides about what they were actually trying to achieve. The Chinese negotiators kept trying to resolve individual incidents without conceding the structural changes Britain wanted. The British kept escalating when Chinese concessions fell short. The Qing court kept replacing officials who made concessions with officials who promised to resist, and then replacing those officials when resistance failed. One moment captures the asymmetry of the conflict with particular clarity. At the Battle of the Bogue, the fortifications guarding the approach to Canton, British warships engaged Chinese shore batteries in January 1841. The Chinese fought with real courage. The forts were manned and the guns were fired, but the British ships, particularly the steam-powered vessels that could maneuver regardless of wind direction, were operating at a level of technological sophistication that the Chinese defenses simply could not match. The battle was over quickly. The human cost was not trivial, but the strategic result was decisive. Canton fell under British control. Negotiations produced a draft agreement, the Convention of Quanbi, in January 1841, which ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain and promised an indemnity. Neither government was satisfied. The Qing court repudiated the agreement and dismissed the official who had signed it. The British government repudiated it too, because it did not go far enough. Palmerston was reportedly furious with Elliot for accepting so little. Elliot was recalled and replaced by Sir Henry Pottinger, a man with a harder edge and clearer instructions. The war resumed. British forces moved north again, this time with greater force and clearer objectives. They took city after city along the coast and up the Yangtze. Ningbo fell. Zhenjiang fell. The fighting at Zhenjiang was particularly brutal, with Manchu Bannermen, the elite military force of the Qing Dynasty, choosing to fight to the death rather than surrender. Their resistance was fierce and ultimately futile. By August 1842, British forces were at Nanjing, the southern capital, threatening to take it. The Qing court faced a choice between fighting on and accepting terms. The emperor chose terms. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed on August 29, 1842, was the first of what the Chinese would come to call the unequal treaties, a phrase that carries enormous weight in Chinese historical memory. Its terms were comprehensive and humiliating. China ceded Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. China opened 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo and Shanghai, to British trade and residents. China paid an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, a sum that included 6 million to compensate the merchants whose opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. The Canton system, the entire framework of restricted trade that China had maintained for over a century, was abolished. Notably, the treaty did not explicitly legalize opium. This was a deliberate omission. The British negotiators understood that making the opium trade a formal part of the treaty would create too much political embarrassment. The trade simply continued, now in a legal grey zone, growing larger every year. There is a moment worth pausing on here. The Treaty of Nanjing is often presented as a simple story of imperial aggression, and in many ways it was. But the picture is more complicated than a straightforward tale of villain and victim. The Qing Dynasty was already under severe internal stress before the British arrived. Corruption was widespread. The military had been hollowed out. The economy was strained. The opium crisis was real and genuinely damaging, but it was also partly a symptom of deeper structural problems in Chinese governance. Historians debate how much the Opium War accelerated China's decline versus how much it simply exposed a decline that was already underway. What is not disputed is how China experienced the outcome. The defeat was not just military. It was existential. For a civilization that had understood itself as the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, the source of order and culture for all surrounding peoples, to be defeated and dictated to by a distant island nation that most educated Chinese had barely heard of a generation earlier, this was a profound shock. It was not processed quickly or easily. The full implications took years, even decades, to sink in, and the story was not over. Not even close. The Treaty of Nanjing opened China, but it did not satisfy the merchants and diplomats who wanted more. The 5 treaty ports were open, but trade did not expand as dramatically as Britain had hoped. Chinese merchants and officials found ways to limit foreign access, to slow the implementation of treaty rights, to maintain as much of the old system as they could within the new legal framework. Foreign merchants complained constantly about obstruction, about broken promises, about the difficulty of doing business in a country that had accepted foreign trade only under duress. Britain, France, and the United States all pressed for renegotiation of the treaties in the early 1850s. The Chinese resisted. The Qing court was also, during this period, fighting for its survival against the Taiping Rebellion, one of the most destructive civil wars in human history, a conflict that would eventually kill tens of millions of people and nearly topple the dynasty entirely. The emperor in Beijing was not in a strong position to resist foreign pressure, but he was also not in a position to make the kind of sweeping concessions that would satisfy Western demands. The pretext for renewed conflict came in October 1856. A ship called the Arrow, a Chinese-owned vessel that had at some point been registered under the British flag, was boarded by Chinese authorities in Canton harbour. The Chinese arrested 12 of the crew on suspicion of piracy and smuggling. The British consul in Canton, a man named Harry Parkes, protested furiously, claiming the British flag had been insulted. The Chinese Governor-General Ye Mingchen investigated and concluded that the Arrow's British registration had actually expired and that the boarding had been entirely legal. The facts were not on Parkes's side. Even the British government's own legal advisors had doubts about the case. But Parkes escalated, demanding an apology, and when Ye refused, British warships began bombarding Canton. This was the beginning of what would become the Second Opium War, also known as the Arrow War. France joined Britain, using the execution of a French missionary in inland China as its own pretext. Together, the two powers assembled a military expedition that was larger and more powerful than the first. The United States and Russia, while not joining the fighting, sent representatives to participate in the diplomatic process, hoping to extract their own concessions. The Second Opium War was, if anything, more clearly unjust in its origins than the first. The Arrow incident was a flimsy pretext. Gladstone said so again in Parliament. The British public was not uniformly enthusiastic. Palmerston, now Prime Minister, actually lost a parliamentary vote on the matter and called a general election, which he won on a wave of nationalist sentiment. Democracy, it turned out, was not always a check on imperial adventure. The military campaign unfolded in stages over several years. Canton was taken and occupied. Ye Mingchen was captured and sent to Calcutta, where he died in exile, reportedly refusing to eat foreign food. a British and French force moved north to Tianjin, the gateway to Beijing, and the Qing court, faced with this direct threat to the capital, agreed to negotiate. The resulting Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 was even more sweeping than Nanjing. It opened 10 more ports. It allowed foreign diplomats to reside in Beijing, a concession of enormous symbolic importance since Beijing had always been the sealed heart of the Chinese world, inaccessible to foreigners. It gave foreign missionaries the right to travel and preach anywhere in China. It legalized the opium trade, and it required China to pay another large indemnity. But the story had one more turn. The Qing court, or at least elements within it, was not ready to accept these terms. When a British and French delegation arrived at the mouth of the Peiho River in 1859 to proceed to Beijing to ratify the treaty, Chinese forces opened fire on the escorting warships. The attack was successful, damaging several ships and forcing a British retreat. It was one of the few Chinese military successes of the entire period, and it was celebrated in Beijing. The celebration was premature. The following year, Britain and France sent an even larger force. The Chinese defenses were overcome. The Allied armies marched toward Beijing. The emperor fled north to his hunting palace at Chengde, leaving his brother Prince Gong to negotiate. What happened next is one of the most debated and emotionally charged episodes in the entire history of Sino-Western relations. The Allied commanders, Lord Elgin for Britain and Baron Gros for France, ordered the destruction of the Yuanming Yuan, the old summer palace, a vast imperial pleasure garden on the outskirts of Beijing that was one of the most spectacular architectural and artistic complexes in the world. It had been built and expanded over more than a century, a landscape of lakes, pavilions, temples and gardens that housed an extraordinary collection of art, books and treasures. The stated reason for the destruction was retaliation for the torture and killing of British and French envoys who had been captured during the negotiations, a genuine atrocity that had outraged the Allied commanders. Lord Elgin argued that destroying the palace would punish the emperor personally, since it was his private property, without punishing the Chinese people. The reasoning was not entirely without logic, but the outcome was not surgical. The palace burned for 3 days. Much of what was lost was irreplaceable. The destruction of the summer palace became, and remains, a defining symbol in Chinese historical memory. It is taught in Chinese schools. It is referenced in Chinese political speeches. The ruins, deliberately preserved, are a tourist site in Beijing today, a monument to what China calls the century of humiliation, the period stretching from the Opium Wars to the mid-20th century, during which China was, in Chinese understanding, exploited, carved up and diminished by foreign powers. The Convention of Peking, signed in October 1860, ended the Second Opium War. It confirmed and expanded the terms of Tientsin. It ceded the Kowloon Peninsula across the harbour from Hong Kong Island to Britain. It opened Tianjin as a treaty port. It further expanded the rights of foreign missionaries. And it completed the transformation of China's relationship with the outside world from one of sovereign control to one of partial subjugation. Now, here is where the story becomes genuinely complex and where the most interesting historical debates live. The standard narrative, particularly as taught in China, is relatively straightforward. The Opium Wars were acts of aggression by a rapacious imperial power, driven by greed and racism, that forced a peaceful civilization to accept poison and exploitation at gunpoint. In this telling, Lin Zexu is a hero, the Qing officials who resisted are patriots, and the treaties are documents of shame imposed by superior force. This narrative captures something real and important. The British use of military force to protect and ultimately legalize a drug trade that was causing genuine harm to millions of Chinese people is not easily defended. The asymmetry of power, the contempt with which many British officials regarded Chinese civilization, the self-serving nature of the free trade arguments being made by people who were simultaneously running one of the most restrictive colonial systems in history in India, all of this is historically documented and morally significant. But the full picture is more complicated. The Qing dynasty's own failures, its corruption, its military decay, its inability to respond effectively to both internal and external challenges, were not caused by Britain. The opium trade was damaging, but the scale of its damage relative to other factors in China's 19th century crisis is genuinely debated by historians. Some scholars argue that the Qing dynasty was already on a trajectory towards serious trouble before the first British ship arrived, that the population had grown faster than agricultural productivity, that the bureaucracy had become sclerotic, that the military had lost its effectiveness. There is also a question about what the opening of China actually meant in practice. The treaty port system that emerged from the Opium Wars was exploitative and unequal, but it also created spaces of commercial and intellectual exchange that had complex effects. Shanghai, which barely existed as a city before the treaty ports, became one of the most dynamic urban environments in Asia within a few decades. Chinese merchants, entrepreneurs, and intellectuals engaged with foreign ideas, technologies, and business practices in ways that were not simply passive victimization. The picture of a purely helpless China being acted upon by a purely aggressive West flattens a reality that was more interactive and more complicated. The opium trade itself, legalized in 1858, actually began to decline in the late 19th century as Chinese-grown opium, produced domestically, increasingly displaced the imported product. The economics changed. The political symbolism did not. What remained constant, and what shaped Chinese political thought for generations, was the memory of the humiliation. The Opium Wars did not just open ports, they shattered a worldview. They forced China to confront, in the most painful way possible, the fact that the world had changed while China was not looking, that the West had developed military and industrial capabilities that the Qing Dynasty had not matched, and that the old assumptions about Chinese centrality and self-sufficiency were no longer adequate. This confrontation produced a century of agonized debate within China about how to respond. Some reformers argued for selective adoption of Western technology while preserving Chinese values, the famous formula of Chinese learning as the essence, Western learning for practical use. Others argued for more fundamental transformation. The self-strengthening movement of the 1860s through 1890s tried to modernize the military and certain industries without touching the political system. It was not enough. China's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895 at the hands of a Japan that had undertaken much more thorough modernization demonstrated the limits of selective reform. The 100 Days Reform of 1898, a more radical attempt to restructure Chinese governance along constitutional lines, was crushed by the Empress Dowager Cixi in a coup. The Boxer Uprising of 1900, a violent anti-foreign movement that the Qing court initially supported, ended in another military defeat and another humiliating treaty. The dynasty itself fell in 1912, replaced by a republic that struggled for decades with warlordism, foreign invasion, and civil war. Every one of these crises was shaped, in part, by the legacy of the Opium Wars. The sense of national humiliation drove Chinese nationalism. The failure of the Qing to resist foreign pressure delegitimized the dynasty. The unequal treaties created a framework of foreign privilege on Chinese soil that Chinese nationalists of all political stripes were determined to abolish. When the Chinese Communist Party came to power in 1949, one of its founding narratives was that it had ended the century of humiliation, had stood China up, had restored the sovereignty that the Opium Wars had begun to erode. That narrative is still politically powerful in China today. The Opium Wars are not ancient history in Chinese political culture. They are a living reference point invoked in discussions of sovereignty, foreign relations, and national dignity. When Chinese officials talk about core interests or warn against foreign interference, they are speaking, at least partly, in the shadow of Lin Zexu's destroyed opium and the burned ruins of the Summer Palace. The British experience of the Opium Wars followed a different trajectory. The wars were controversial at the time, as the debates in Parliament show. But they were also quickly absorbed into the larger narrative of imperial expansion, trade, and civilization that dominated Victorian Britain. Hong Kong became a successful colonial port, and its success was taken as justification for the policy that created it. The unequal treaties were part of the infrastructure of British commercial power in Asia, largely invisible to the British public. The moral reckoning came later, and it came incompletely. British historical education has generally not given the Opium Wars the same prominence that Chinese education has. The wars appear in British textbooks as episodes in the history of empire, significant but not central. The specific role of opium, the deliberate exploitation of addiction as a commercial strategy, has been more thoroughly examined by historians than it has been acknowledged in popular British culture. There is a three-part wow buried in this history that deserves explicit attention, because each one reframes what you think you know about this story. The first is the sheer scale of the opium trade and what it reveals about the relationship between legitimate commerce and empire. The East India Company was not a criminal organization in the conventional sense. It was a chartered corporation with shareholders, a board of directors, and parliamentary oversight. It was the institutional expression of British commercial power, and it built a drug trafficking operation of global scale, not because its leaders were uniquely evil, but because the logic of commercial empire, the need to balance trade, to find markets, to generate returns for investors, drove it there. The opium trade was not an aberration. It was what the system produced when it needed to solve a problem. The second is Lin Zexu's letter to Queen Victoria. Set aside for a moment whether the letter was delivered, whether it was read, whether it had any effect. Focus on what it says. Here is a Chinese official, writing in 1839, making a moral argument against drug trafficking that would be completely recognizable to a modern reader. He is not arguing from a position of weakness or desperation. He is arguing from a position of moral confidence, from a Confucian framework that placed the welfare of the people at the center of legitimate governance. His argument was correct. His position was legally and morally defensible. And it made absolutely no difference, because the force arrayed against him was not primarily moral, but military and commercial. The letter is a monument to the limits of moral argument in the face of power. The third is Hong Kong itself. The island was ceded in 1842 as a direct consequence of the First Opium War. It was described at the time by some British officials as a barren rock with barely a house on it. Over the following century and a half, it became one of the most economically dynamic cities in the world, a place where Chinese commercial genius and British legal and institutional frameworks combined to create something neither could have produced alone. Hong Kong's history is a deeply complicated story, involving colonial exploitation, remarkable economic achievement, political suppression, and eventually the question of its return to China in 1997. But the fact that this extraordinary place exists at all is a direct consequence of the Opium Wars. History's consequences are rarely simple. Let us return for a moment to the human scale of this story, because it is easy, in a narrative about empires and treaties and trade balances, to lose sight of the people. Think about the Chinese farmer in Fujian province in the 1840s, watching his son spend the family's savings on opium, watching the silver drain away, watching the tax collector come and take more because the government needed revenue to pay the British indemnity. He did not understand the Treaty of Nanjing. He had never heard of Lord Palmerston. He just knew that something had gone wrong with the world and that the people in charge had failed to protect him. Think about the British sailor on one of those warships moving up the Yangtze, 19 years old, from Birmingham or Glasgow, who had signed up because the Navy offered food and adventure and a way out of a factory town. He was not thinking about trade policy. He was thinking about the man in the fort on the riverbank who was trying to kill him, and about whether he would be alive at the end of the day. Think about the Chinese official in Canton who knew perfectly well that the opium trade was wrong, who had accepted bribes to look the other way for years, who now watched Lin Zexu arrive with imperial authority and felt the ground shift under his feet, knowing that the old accommodations were over and that whatever came next was going to be painful. Think about the merchants, both Chinese and foreign, who had built their lives and fortunes on the trade at Canton, who had developed relationships across cultural lines, who had created, in the small world of the trading factories, something that was neither purely Chinese nor purely Western, but a hybrid commercial culture, and who watched that world destroyed by forces neither side fully controlled. History is made by people, and the Opium Wars were made by thousands of individual decisions, accommodations, acts of courage, acts of cowardice, moments of clarity, and moments of catastrophic miscalculation. The grand narrative of empire and humiliation is real, but it is built from human material. The legacy of the Opium Wars extends in directions that are still unfolding. The framework of international relations that emerged from the 19th century, the system of sovereign equality, treaty rights, and diplomatic recognition that we now take for granted, was built partly on the ruins of the older Chinese world order. China's integration into that system was painful and involuntary. The resentment it generated did not disappear when the unequal treaties were finally abolished in the mid-20th century. It was sublimated into the political culture of the People's Republic, where it remains a source of both genuine grievance and deliberate political mobilization. The question of how China relates to the international order, whether it accepts the rules of that order, seeks to modify them, or aspires to replace them, is one of the defining questions of 21st century geopolitics. You cannot understand that question without understanding the Opium Wars. You cannot understand why Chinese officials respond with such intensity to perceived slights on Chinese sovereignty without understanding what sovereignty meant to lose in 1842 and 1860. You cannot understand the emotional weight of Hong Kong's return to China in 1997, or the political sensitivity of Taiwan, or the rhetoric of national rejuvenation, without tracing those feelings back to the moment when a British fleet appeared off the Chinese coast, and the world's oldest continuous civilization discovered that the world had changed. There is a final irony worth noting. Britain, which forced China open in the name of free trade, eventually found that the China it had forced open was not simply a passive market waiting to be filled with British goods. Chinese merchants, entrepreneurs, and eventually manufacturers learned, adapted, and competed. The China that emerged from the century of humiliation was not the China that had entered it. It was tougher, more self-aware, more determined to master the tools of the modern world on its own terms. The process was agonizing, and the cost was enormous. But the outcome was not what Palmerston had envisioned. The Opium Wars are a story about power, but they are also a story about the limits of power. You can force a country to sign a treaty. You cannot force a civilization to stop being itself. You can burn a palace. You cannot burn a memory. You can open ports. You cannot open mines on your own schedule. Lin Zexu, the man who destroyed the opium and wrote the unanswered letter, was exiled by the Qing Emperor after the military defeat, a scapegoat for a failure that was not his fault. He died in 1850 before he could see how the story continued. But he is remembered in China today as a national hero, one of the first officials to recognize the foreign threat clearly and to respond to it with both moral clarity and practical determination. There is a statue of him in New York's Chinatown, a gift from the Chinese government. He stands there in Lower Manhattan, not far from where the ships of the old Atlantic trade once docked, a reminder that history travels. The Opium Wars lasted, in their two phases, roughly 20 years. The treaties they produced lasted, in various forms, for a century. The memory of them has lasted longer still and shows no sign of fading. They are a case study in how commercial interest becomes military policy, how military policy reshapes civilizations, and how the wounds of history, if they are not understood and acknowledged, tend to reopen. They are also, if you look at them honestly, a story about a world in transition, about two great civilizations, each operating on assumptions that were no longer adequate, colliding in a moment of mutual incomprehension that neither fully understood and neither fully controlled. Britain did not set out to humiliate China. It set out to sell things and make money. China did not set out to provoke Britain. It set out to maintain order and sovereignty. The catastrophe was produced by the collision of these two projects in a world where the rules had not yet been written. We are still writing those rules. That is why this story still matters. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about how empires collide, how history's wounds shape the present, and why the 19th century still echoes in the 21st, then you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is made for. There is so much more to explore. The century of humiliation does not end with the Opium Wars. It continues through the Taiping Rebellion, the fall of the Qing, the warlord era, and beyond. And on the other side of the story, the British Empire was simultaneously reshaping India, Africa, and the Middle East in ways that are just as consequential and just as complex. If you want to go deeper, hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. If this video made you think or changed how you see something you thought you already understood, leave a comment below. Tell me what surprised you, what you want to know more about, or where you think the story should go next. Your comments genuinely shape what gets made here. And if you know someone who would find this history as fascinating as you do, share this video with them. The best way to understand the world we live in is to understand how it was made. That is what this channel is for. The rules that governed the world before the Opium Wars were not written down in any single document. They were embedded in practice, in ritual, in the accumulated weight of centuries. The tribute system that China had maintained across East Asia was not simply a diplomatic arrangement. It was a cosmological statement. The emperor in Beijing was not merely a head of state. He was the son of heaven, the pivot around which the moral order of the universe turned. Foreign rulers who sent missions to Beijing were not just conducting diplomacy. They were acknowledging a hierarchy that was understood to be natural, eternal, and self-evident. The British, arriving with their own set of equally confident assumptions about civilization, progress, and the natural right of commercial nations to access markets, were not simply challenging Chinese trade policy. They were, whether they knew it or not, challenging an entire way of organizing the world. And the Qing court's resistance to British demands was not simply stubbornness or pride. It was the defense of a worldview in which the British demands were literally incomprehensible, not just politically unacceptable, but categorically outside the framework of how the world was supposed to work. This is why the failure of the Macartney mission in 1793 was so complete and so consequential. Lord Macartney arrived in China with a ship full of British-manufactured goods, samples of everything the Industrial Revolution had produced: clocks, telescopes, scientific instruments, textiles, weapons. He wanted to demonstrate British ingenuity and open a dialogue about trade. The Qianlong Emperor received him, examined the goods, and was unimpressed. The famous letter dismissing British requests was not written in bad faith. It reflected a genuine assessment. China had everything it needed. The British had nothing to offer that China could not produce itself or do without. What the Emperor could not assess, because the evidence was not yet fully visible, was the trajectory. Britain was not just producing clever goods. It was in the middle of a transformation that would, within a few decades, give it military and industrial capabilities that no pre-industrial civilization could match. The steam engine, the mechanized textile mill, the iron-hulled warship, the percussion cap rifle. These were not just better versions of existing tools. They represented a qualitative break with everything that had come before. The Qing court, looking at British manufactures in 1793, saw curiosities. It did not see the future bearing down on it. By the time the future arrived in the form of British gunboats in 1839, the gap had become unbridgeable in the short term. This is the technological dimension of the Opium Wars that often gets lost in the moral and political debates. The question of whether Britain was right or wrong, justified or unjust, is important and genuinely contested. But underneath that question is a harder one. What happens when a civilization that has been dominant for millennia encounters another civilization that has, in a very short period of time, developed capabilities that render the old dominance irrelevant? The answer in China's case was not immediate adaptation. It was first denial, then shock, then a long and agonizing search for the right response. The Chinese intellectual and political tradition had enormous resources for dealing with moral challenges, for reforming corrupt officials, for restoring dynastic virtue. It did not have ready-made frameworks for dealing with a technologically superior external threat that operated on entirely different assumptions about sovereignty, commerce, and international relations. The Confucian framework that had served China so well for so long actually made the adaptation harder in some ways. The examination system that produced the Qing bureaucracy was designed to select men of classical learning and moral cultivation. It was not designed to produce engineers, naval commanders, or trade negotiators familiar with Western legal concepts. The officials who dealt with the British in the 1840s and 1850s were, by and large, highly educated, deeply principled men who were operating with entirely the wrong set of tools. Their moral clarity was real. Their strategic helplessness was equally real. This mismatch between moral framework and strategic reality is one of the genuinely tragic dimensions of the Opium Wars. Lin Zexu was not wrong about the opium trade. His analysis of its effects was accurate. His moral argument was sound. His destruction of the opium stocks was legally defensible under Chinese law, and none of it mattered because the side he was arguing against had warships and the willingness to use them. The aftermath of the First Opium War produced, in certain Chinese intellectual circles, a new kind of urgency about understanding the West. Wei Yuan, a scholar and official who worked with Lin Zexu, produced a remarkable work called the Illustrated Treatise on the Maritime Kingdoms, published in 1843, just a year after the Treaty of Nanjing. It was one of the first serious Chinese attempts to systematically describe the geography, history, and military capabilities of Western nations. Wei Yuan's famous formulation, "Learn the superior techniques of the barbarians in order to control the barbarians," became a touchstone for a generation of Chinese reformers. The phrase is worth unpacking because it reveals both the insight and the limitation of the early Chinese response. The insight was correct. China needed to understand and acquire Western military technology. The limitation was in the framing. The word barbarians was not just an insult, it was a category that placed Western power in a specific relationship to Chinese civilization, one in which Western techniques were tools to be borrowed while Chinese values remained the foundation. The assumption was that you could take the technology without taking the worldview that had produced it, that you could have steam engines without liberalism, ironclad warships without constitutionalism, modern artillery without modern institutions. Japan, facing a similar crisis a generation later when American warships arrived in Edo Bay in 1853, made a different calculation. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 involved a far more thorough and deliberate dismantling of traditional institutions and their replacement with Western-style alternatives. Japan built a modern navy, a modern army, a constitutional government, a national railway system, and a modern education system within a generation. The results were dramatic. By 1905, Japan had defeated Russia in a full-scale war, the first time in the modern era that an Asian power had defeated a European one. China watched Japan's transformation with a mixture of admiration and alarm. The reformers who launched the 100 Days Reform in 1898 were explicitly inspired by the Japanese model. But where Japan had carried out its transformation from a position of relative unity, with the Meiji oligarchs in firm control, China's reform attempts ran into the entrenched interests of the Qing court, the resistance of conservative officials, and the sheer scale of a civilization that was orders of magnitude larger and more complex than Japan. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who crushed the 100 Days Reform and imprisoned or executed its leaders, is often cast as the villain of this chapter, the reactionary force that prevented China from modernizing in time. The reality is more nuanced. Cixi was a shrewd political operator who had maintained power in an extraordinarily difficult environment for decades. Her opposition to the 1898 reforms was not simply ignorance or obscurantism. It was, at least partly, a calculation that the reforms were moving too fast, threatening too many powerful interests simultaneously, and risking the kind of political instability that would be even more dangerous than the status quo. She may have been right about the political risks and wrong about the historical stakes. The Qing Dynasty fell 14 years after she died, in 1912, brought down by a combination of military mutiny, provincial separatism, and the accumulated weight of a century of failed responses to the challenges that the Opium Wars had first made visible. The republic that replaced the Qing inherited all of its problems and added new ones. The warlord era of the 1910s and 1920s, the Japanese invasion of the 1930s and 1940s, the civil war between nationalists and communists, all of these catastrophes were downstream in various ways from the crisis that began with the Opium Wars. The century of humiliation was not a metaphor. It was a lived experience across multiple generations of Chinese people, a period in which the state repeatedly failed to protect its citizens from foreign violence and exploitation. When Mao Zedong stood in Tiananmen Square on October 1, 1949, and declared that the Chinese people had stood up, he was speaking directly to that history. The founding of the People's Republic was understood by its founders and by most of the Chinese people, not primarily as a communist revolution in the European sense, but as the restoration of Chinese sovereignty and dignity after a century of humiliation. The specific ideology was secondary to the national narrative. China was whole again, China was strong again, the unequal treaties were gone. The foreign concessions were gone. Hong Kong remained, for the moment, a British colony, a fact that rankled, but its return was understood to be a matter of time. The handover of Hong Kong in 1997 was, in this light, not just a transfer of sovereignty over a small territory. It was the symbolic closing of a chapter that had opened with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. The ceremony was laden with historical weight on both sides. For Britain, it was the end of empire in a very visible and televised sense, the lowering of the flag over what had been one of the most successful colonial ports in history. For China, it was the moment when the last major territorial consequence of the Opium Wars was reversed. The complexity of Hong Kong's subsequent history, the tensions between the city's liberal political culture and Beijing's insistence on sovereignty, the protests of 2019 and the national security law of 2020, all of this is, among other things, a continuation of the argument that began in the 1840s. What does sovereignty mean? Who defines the terms of a society's relationship with the outside world? How do you balance the claims of commerce and openness against the claims of political control and national dignity? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that the Opium Wars first forced onto the table, and they have not been resolved. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves attention before we close, and it is the one that is perhaps most uncomfortable for a Western audience. The Opium Wars were not unique. They were, in important ways, representative of a broader pattern of how European imperial power expanded in the 19th century, using commercial grievances as pretexts for military intervention, imposing unequal treaties on weaker states, creating legal frameworks that privileged foreign nationals over local populations, and justifying all of it with the language of free trade, civilization, and progress. This pattern played out in different forms across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The specific details varied. The underlying logic was remarkably consistent. And the legacy of that logic, the resentment it generated, the nationalist movements it provoked, the political cultures it shaped, is still very much with us. Understanding the Opium Wars, then, is not just an exercise in learning about 19th century China or 19th century Britain. It is an exercise in understanding how the modern world was made and why so much of it is still contested. The frameworks of international law, the institutions of global commerce, the boundaries of sovereign states, the hierarchies of power that structure international relations, all of these bear the marks of how they were created, and they were created, in significant part, through processes that looked a great deal like what happened to China between 1839 and 1860. None of this means that the story is simply one of Western guilt and non-Western victimhood. History is never that clean. The Qing Dynasty's own failures were real. The complexity of Chinese responses to Western pressure, the range of strategies tried, the genuine debates within Chinese society about how to modernize, the remarkable resilience of Chinese culture and commerce even under extreme pressure, all of this is part of the story too. So is the fact that the international order that emerged from the 19th century, for all its origins in imperial violence, has provided a framework within which China has achieved the most remarkable economic transformation in human history over the past 4 decades. The Opium Wars are a story without a clean ending, because the questions they raised are still being answered. How do great civilizations manage their encounters with each other? What is the relationship between commercial interest and moral responsibility? How do nations process historical grievance without being imprisoned by it? How do we build international orders that are genuinely fair rather than merely reflecting the preferences of whoever was strongest when the rules were written? These are the questions that the smoke over Lin Zexu's opium trenches, the sound of British guns on the Pearl River, the flames over the Summer Palace, and the ink on the Treaty of Nanjing have bequeathed to us. They are worth sitting with. They are worth arguing about. They are, in the deepest sense, still live questions. The world that the Opium Wars helped to make is the world we still live in. And understanding how it was made is the first step toward understanding what it might yet become. If you made it to the end of this video, you already know that history is not just a list of dates and battles. It is the story of how the world we inherited came to be and why it looks the way it does. The Opium Wars are one of those hinge moments where you can see the gears of history turning in real time, where you can watch a world order ending and a new one beginning, and where the human cost of that transition is impossible to ignore. If this kind of deep, honest historical storytelling is what you're looking for, then subscribe to this channel. Every video is built on the same foundation: rigorous research, honest engagement with complexity, and a genuine effort to make history feel as alive and urgent as it actually is. Leave a comment below and tell me what you want to explore next. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, unfolding in China at almost exactly the same time as the Second Opium War. The Meiji Restoration and Japan's extraordinary transformation. The full story of the century of humiliation and how it shaped modern China. Your suggestions drive this channel forward. And if this video gave you something worth sharing, pass it on. History belongs to everyone who is willing to engage with it seriously. Thank you for watching.